All right, and here we are switching over to the live audio. So we're going to go ahead and get started with triggers. So the main objective that was selected by the community was the protecting civilians against a big onslaught, evacuating civilians. So as you saw in the montage, I created a kind of last stand section here with bugs assaulting, and we're going to make some triggers and objectives to allow the player to take on some neat objectives while defending the city, protecting the civilians, as well as throwing some surprises in. So I've set up the groundworks for a couple objectives here, including potentially taking out some bug hives if we decide to, and taking on a last-ditch assault with these invasion waves down here that I'm preparing. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. We've got to make some objectives. So let's think out some objectives to start with. It's a good idea after you've set up your map, you have the idea in your head. It's good to start with objectives because those will help you build your triggers. So we're going to have a couple objectives here. The first objective is protect the port. The next objective we're going to have is we're going to have escort civilians to safety. So we're going to have some civilians coming from different directions, different points on the map that are going to need protecting, and getting to the evacuation pad. So we're going to go ahead and create another objective, and I'm going to go ahead and disable these objectives so that way they're not starting at the start of the mission. So we're going to go ahead and make an objective called Don't Lose Radio Post. So that way, if they lose the radio post, the mission ends. So the mission's going to keep going until you have enough civilians, or we might create an internal timer to keep track of things. But ultimately, our ultimate fail condition is don't lose the radio post. We're then going to create a couple secondary objectives. This is going to be part of the surprise me moral dilemma question that was created, which was rescue stranded civilians and secure supply stash. Let's name it cash. So we're going to have two secondary objectives here, and they're going to correspond to this section here, which is going to be the easier moral objective to accomplish, but the harder one will be rescuing civilians, which may ultimately help you complete the mission faster, depending on how we set things up, or this would allow you, this moral objective would allow you to create more units to hold out longer. So do you want to hold out longer or complete the mission sooner, depending on how we set this up. So we're still kind of going through this live here. So this is kind of the thought process that happened here. So we're going to go ahead and let's see, what other objectives could we have? We could have a clear bug holes secondary objective. And then I think it would make sense for us to have to come over here and destroy some bug holes in order to protect civilians along these routes. So I'm going to go ahead and this kind of happens whenever you're making something is, oh, I know, I'm going to create some layers instead. So they're not going to be as high profile as other bug holes. So they're kind of like extensions to the bug network. But they're still a threat, especially to civilians that are going to be coming down these routes here. So we'll give the opportunity for the player to allow more civilians to survive. And then we've got some AI units set up along the walls here. And then I'm using that free rotation and incremental dynamic leveling system, as you can see, to create bug piles up on the wall from when maybe bugs were trying to climb up the wall defenses here. There's little things all across the map, like a crashed Viking. So we've got some neat environment to work around. So we're going to want to make this a little more difficult to acquire. So we'll have to come back to this one. Maybe we just won't make these capturable until the time comes. So we'll make those part of green players so we can't take them over. And then we'll make them capturable later. That way, people don't come over here, preemptively capture the supplies, and preempt the moral dilemma. And trust me, if you don't think players will do something, they absolutely will do that. So, I have learned that quite a lot with making missions. Alright, so we've got our core primary objectives. Now, part of this mission, I've planned it out, is we have three main characters that are going to be kind of part of this mission, that are going to be guiding the player to different objectives. We have City Representative Mayor Elena Ramirez. We have your military advisor, Colonel Victoria Sinclair. And then we have an influential citizen or civilian, Samuel Thornfield. You can think of them as an influencer here in the city. But people tend to listen to Samuel more than the mayor. So that's kind of going to be the overarching conflicts is between those three characters as we go through this mission. So we definitely have a lot of character development to work through this mission. All right, so we've got our objectives. We preemptively set up our players, and we are ready to get going. So I'm going to go ahead and let's get a couple folders going. I'm actually going to start with an init trigger. So, and then I'm going to set this to init. So, what this is going to do is this is going to make sure a trigger, this trigger will run with system preferences that we set up for this mission. How much war support does the player start with? How much supply? How many dropships are available, etc. So, this is going to be an important trigger for us to set the groundwork. It's even going to set the basic camera position for us. So, for example, let's go ahead and grab the effect. Where did camera focus? So we're going to go ahead and get started with a camera move starting here. And then I'm going to be referring to a chart that I created in one of my YouTube videos on creating custom camera angles. So I want the camera to start here and looking at the city. So kind of perusing in. Maybe we want to do it right around. No, this will be good. So we want to change the facing, and I want this to be 360 degrees. And I want this to be an instant camera move change. And so let's see here. So for right now, roughly, if I were to move the camera, this is what we would be looking at. So I'm going to move the camera to the left just a little bit so we kind of get all three of those squads there. And then I'm going to go ahead and place down some cinematic bugs for us to have. So we're going to have some bugs assaulting. And then we're going to do unit, move, attack move. So we're going to have that unit move there. And we're going to have that unit move there. So we might have some casualties, but overall, we should be good to go. So, just to show you what we're kind of working with, we're going to go ahead and okay, allies are sharing a line of sight. We're going to go ahead and check this out. A lot of what I do, especially with minute things like camera angles and such, is I do a lot of this here, just going in and testing. So it looks like our camera move did not actually work. So let's go ahead and see what ended up happening with that, and we'll go ahead and get going. Let's try an alternate number. Oh, let's see here. I did that wrong. Let's do -315. That should give us the camera angle we're looking for. It helps if I read my own chart. Here we go. So we're going to have a good camera angle here. So, one question that I typically come up with is whether or not to use Shroud. Shroud is useful for different situations where you don't have a clear visibility of the map. It's not a well-known area, and you're kind of exploring as you go. But I like to turn Shroud off when it comes to planets that I do know. Planets that the Federation would know, that have good intel on. So I'm going to leave Shroud off for this mission. So I'm going to go ahead and clone this camera move. I'm going to turn instant move off, and I'm going to do about 10 degrees. And I'm going to move the camera towards the port here. Okay, so we'll be moving towards the port for this cinematic. And then what you're going to see off camera is I'm going to be adding in some custom character profile pictures here a little later. But for right now, I'm just going to be using some different default characters for the start. So, and I'll be including voiceovers later as well. All that will be off screen. So I'm going to go ahead and get this going here. So this one's going to be our advisor, military advisor. And then I had a planet name. Let's see here. What is this planet called? Helps if I have a if I had written this down. All right. So we're going to call this city Etheria. We're going to call it Etheria for right now. Lieutenant, welcome to Etheria, the last stronghold on the planet. All right, so we have Lieutenant, welcome to Etheria, the last stronghold on the planet. We have a lot of civilians making their way here to evacuate, and a hell of a lot of bugs. We need to protect them with our lives if need be. So let's go ahead and make sure that that works. Lieutenant, welcome to Etheria, the last stronghold on the planet. Well, I'm definitely going to need to work on the timing, but that's going to help us set the scene here for the city. And I'm going to go ahead and move this unit, because I want the player to take control of these units as their starting unit. So we'll go ahead and shift that around. There we go. So these are going to be the starting units that the player has control over. I'm going to give them a couple more, just at different choke points. Going to give the player a lot of options here. One there. We'll do 2 here. Okay, so that gives the player 9, 12, 15, 18, 21 starting supply, which is a lot to begin with, but we're going to go ahead and make sure that that's a little balanced later on by disabling certain units from being used. So we have our opening cinematic, and I'm going to say let's give this about 10 seconds to read through. All right, so now I've set up how everything's going to play, and I'm going to reset to the camera move. I'm going to set it to instant, set it back to -45, which is the default orientation. And then I'm going to make this play after 10 seconds to give enough time for the briefing to play through. And then I'm going to use the effect called Unit Owner Switch. And I'm going to select each of these and make the new owner be the player. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat this by using the clone function, removing a unit, and then selecting a new unit. So what we should see now is that after the camera move has concluded and the briefing has concluded, roughly, the camera move should pitch back to normal and focus on this spot, and then the 3 rifle squads become available to the player to use. So that's how we're going to go ahead and start this. I'm not going to go into every single trigger here. A lot of it's going to be pretty basic. But now that we've got our opening set up, I want to set up a trigger for each of the main events that are going to be happening. So we're going to set up a potential fail trigger. We're going to set up the moral dilemma, the bug assault, and then the optional objectives here. We're also going to be setting up recurring waves of civilians making their way here and evacuating. So let's go ahead and get started. The one that a lot of people are probably going to be curious about is going to be how I'm going to be handling the civilians. What I'm going to be doing is I have these invisible carriers that I'm going to be spawning civilians through. And what's going to end up happening is they're going to be coming down these paths and heading down to these evacuation pads for evacuation. Now, if the player does nothing at a much slower pace, I'm going to be having bonus civilians spawning from these subways, as well as maybe a little surprise. Just so the player, if they're having a hard time defending the city and not able to branch off out into the world to defend and escort the civilians, they're not going to totally lose out on the mission if they're struggling to even just hold a defense. So we're going to have some civilians coming out of these subways as well at a much slower pace than usual. But we also might have a couple surprises come out. So we're going to go ahead and get started on spawning the civilians. So I'm going to do civilian road spawn as my trigger here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new trigger. And I'm going to go ahead and do civilian spawn roads. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the unit spawn function. And under the green player, I'm going to spawn colonists from here 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 and here. Okay, sometimes you need to make sure you're not crazy. All right, so we're gonna have this wait. We're gonna set a wait condition. It's gonna be repeating, but we're gonna have this initially wait 60 seconds. That should be enough time, and I'm gonna tweak this later. That should be enough time for the initial briefing, character introductions to happen. And then what I'm going to do is, with this timeline button set, I'm going to go ahead and set an additional wait. And it's going to do, actually, I'm going to make this a little easier on myself. I'm going to make this spawn only once. I'm going to clone this trigger. I'm going to make this work for me math-wise. So I'm going to have new civilians spawn, let's say every 3 minutes. So that would be 180 seconds. So 180 seconds is going to go by and spawn units on the 4 main paths here. Some of them are going to be a little easier to get through, some of them not so much. So we're also going to have this trigger enable this clone here, which I'm going to rename. Now, one thing I could have done to make things a little easier on myself is I could have waited. Because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have a blackboard here. I'm going to call this Civ 1, Civ 2, Civ 3, and Civ 4. Now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be having these units move with an evacuation. So I'm going to do Civ 1 is going to evacuate on this pad here. Civ 2 is also going to evacuate from that pad. I'm going to have Civ 3 evacuate from that pad. And I'm going to have Civ 4 evacuate from this pad. So there's going to be a continuous stream of units coming here and evacuating. So I can make things a little easy for myself, and I can move these down here. So what I'm doing is I'm just cloning each of these. And then I'm going to give the blackboard names to this. This is how you kind of adapt without having to completely restart your trigger or scrap something. And it's just a different way of thinking a little bit. Now, one thing to note is it does take a few seconds for the civilians to spawn. So I'm going to go ahead and give them 6 seconds before the move order happens. So that gives them plenty of time to spawn and then be able to accept orders, such as evacuate. So now we've got our recurring civilians. We're sharing line of sight, so we'll be able to see them on the roads. Oh, and because we added extra units to the player, we're going to need to make sure that these ones get added to the player. All right, so we should be good with that now. Cool. So we've got our recurring road spawn, and what I'm going to do with this is every 9 minutes, so every 3 waves of civilians that come through. Actually, I have a feeling it's gonna be a little faster if I do it that way. So I'm gonna slow down this a little bit, and I'm gonna do civilian metro spawn I'm going to do this a little differently. I'm going to make this metro spawn happen every 15 minutes. So it's going very poorly for the player. They're having a very hard time with managing the defense here. So we're going to go ahead and do some cloning here. And I'm going to be sure to rename this to Civ 5 and Civ 6 and have them spawn from these invisible carriers instead. All right. So 15 minutes is 900 seconds. So every 900 seconds, this is going to happen. The units are going to spawn from these carriers, the civilians, and I'm going to have them evacuate from these two pads. So this one I'm going to have go to the farthest pad here. So I'm going to give Civ 5 an evacuate order to this pad. And I'm going to give Civ 6 an evacuate order to this pad. Cool. And I'm going to make it wait 6 seconds just to make sure that all the units have spawned and able to take orders. Now, I want something tricky to happen here. So, I'm going to have another trigger inside this metro. And I'm going to have bug metro spawn. So I'm going to be having a couple surprises for players here. Not managing their defenses. Maybe they sacrifice a couple war support in order to defend this area. But I'm going to have it where every... let's see. I'm going to have it where every 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes, so I'm actually going to use the wait condition time for this one. Every 20 minutes, I'm going to have some arachnid warrior bugs spawn from these. And I'm not going to give them a move order or an attack order. They're going to do their thing. The primary thing that they're going to be doing is disrupting you from protecting civilians. And I'm not going to change any of the member amounts because I want the full bugs to... The full units, all 12 warrior bugs in a squad to spawn. All right. So we've got our two main triggers, or we've got our main kind of civilian metro and our kind of surprise bugs inside start. And I'll add some dialogue and audio so the player is prompted, hey, look out! Bugs from the metro. So we're gonna have that doing pretty good. So now what we've got is we've got some interesting triggers here set up with civilians coming from outside the map. Now what we're gonna need to do is we're gonna need to come up with a way to score it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to find this out together. I'm going to go ahead and make a trigger here. And I'm going to call it Civilians Evacuated. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do some variables. So we're going to do some interesting stuff. So let's see. unit status in orbit. No, that's not going to help us here. So let's do unit count. In orbit. And we're going to do civilians. Now, this may, colonists, this may not work. So, if this does not work, I'm going to cut this portion out so that way you don't have to see me bang my head against the wall on this. But in theory, this should be good. So we want to evacuate. Let's see, we've got 4 coming in from the outside, 2 from the inside, so 6. We're going to want about 4 waves of civilians to make it to evacuation before we count anything as completed. So we're going to go ahead and output this to the escort civilians to safety objective. And we're going to be exporting this variable to we're going to be exporting the results here to the variable evacuated, so we can have different things kind of play with it. So we're going to go ahead and name, so we want 4, 6, 12, 18, 24. So we want 24 civilians to be escorted to orbit. So we're going to see if this works for us. So I'm going to go ahead and see if orbit works here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this portion out while I go test this. All right, so we're back. The objective works. So that's definitely going to help us here. I'm going to go ahead and reset this. One thing that I did end up noticing was the pathing of all of these. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust these and make sure that the civilians do actually need to be defended in order for them to efficiently arrive. So a couple of them were taking interesting paths to get to it that were nowhere near the path that was intended. So I'm going to adjust that for the pathing. And I'm going to also adjust the pathing for this as well. This should help. Cool. So we've tested and made sure that the objective is outputted correctly once people start getting evacuated. So we're going to go ahead and make sure. Let me go ahead and disable that for right now. Let's see here. We're going to need a couple initial bug defenders. So I'm going to do 5 attached to each of these bug layers. There we go. And I'm going to attach them so hopefully they respawn at a decent span of time. All right. So we've set up the need to go out and defend the civilians as they traverse the hostile planet. All right.